How can we break free from the grip of financial fear? I'm Aaron Young.
I'm Andrew Woodward. Investment Insights starts now.
Hello and welcome to Investment Insights, presented by The Investor's Way. Each episode we dive into the world of wealth creation and provide practical tips of how you can master your money. Now in this episode we're uncovering what it takes to foster a resilient money mindset. So welcome back to the program, Andrew Woodward.
Thanks for having me back,
What does it all mean?
What does it all mean? Well, we've brought an expert in the field into studio to talk to us. So we've got Gabrielle Pearson from Gabrielle Pearson Consulting, and she's going to tell us all about mindset. And to kick it off, I want to ask you what triggers emotional decision making in investing, and why does it often lead to poor results?
Well, Andrew, that's a great question. I think first and foremost, when it comes to making emotional decisions or emotional choices, there's always an underlying cause, and quite often that bubbles to the surface in the form of what we call a trigger. And when you start to understand what is a trigger and what purpose does it serve, basically a trigger is like like the lamp on your car's dashboard. When it lights up, it's telling you something's not quite right, and you've got to take it either to the mechanic or to the workshop to get it investigated. So when you suddenly have this trigger, which is like this sudden onset surge of emotions, and they can be based in fear, anxiety, or even rage and anger, that's your psyche's way of telling you there's something that's bubbling down underneath the surface in what we call our subconscious mind, and it's telling you that there's some unresolved issues there that you need to start paying attention to.
It is funny you talk about the car, and usually when you go and do these things, or a dentist is another one where you're in so much pain that you rock up and you say, just fix it. And they look at you and say, why didn't you deal with this sooner? I think that's the challenge for a lot of people, not knowing that there is something to deal with.
Yes.
And quite often we remedy ourselves with whatever can help us get through the day without dealing with the long-term consequences, right?
Absolutely. And what we find is that when you're making emotionally driven decisions, they're based, because they're based basically on fear, is the underlying cause, and a lot of unresolved emotions that are down in your subconscious, belief systems, some of the stories you tell yourself. Unless you start working on resolving those, when you make these decisions, they're quite often, they're short-term, they're haste decisions, and you're not really thinking about the long-term impact. So, yeah.
Andrew, I'll bring it back to you for a moment. When you hear that and you think about many of the people that you have dealt with over the years, talk to us about what the impact can be of holding on until the little red light goes.
Yeah, so when it comes to people's money and that emotional decision making, which we've talked before on this show about, it's that short-term focus that Gabrielle mentioned, is that people are not looking beyond that fear or beyond that uncertainty to the longer-term benefit of what they're trying to do, and are very much fear-based in their decision-making. And that leads to decisions that are not optimised for the outcomes that somebody's looking for when it comes to their money, because they're not looking beyond their own fears. And I think what we're starting to uncover here is the difference between a scarcity mindset and an abundance mindset. And I wanted to try to lead Gabrielle down that path of maybe explaining a little bit about that scarcity versus abundance.
Absolutely. And I think you've pretty much touched on one of the little core essences there is you're either by default, you tend to lean towards either a scarcity type of mindset or an abundance type of mindset. And to explain a little bit what that is, if you are navigating in what we call a scarcity mindset, you're often, as they're driven by fears, you're very overly cautious, you can be very skeptical, hypercritical, very risk averse, and you tend to make these short-term decisions because the fear of loss is a lot stronger than the fear of gain. Versus if you flip that on its head to an abundant mindset, that's where you come with, you've got a more optimistic outlook. You tend to take more what I call informed and calculated risks and decisions, because you're looking at the opportunities for growth. You also have a tendency to potentially sort of think about looking down new pathways. So it's definitely, there is a strong difference between the two, and you tend to either default between one or the other.
How does it play out in real life? So if we talk about scarcity, it sounds pretty pessimistic. And a lot of people in that situation might say they're not being pessimists, they're being realistic. And they talk themselves into believing that everything, the sky is falling, ignoring any, as you say, resilience signs or growth shoot signs there as well, and can start to focus on what's wrong with my team, what's wrong with everything around me, and tinkering to try and fix things, compared to that idea of actually the problem's out there and we just have to focus on that. Is that how you describe it?
Yeah, I think you've touched on something very key here, is that basically when you start looking at any form of whether you're going to growth or change, the first place you've got to look is internally at yourself.
Yes.
And that's where, before you start doing the blame game or looking at your team or what processes need to be changed, etc., start looking at your own belief system and the stories that you've built up over the time, which over time, your mind doesn't know the difference between a lie and truth. So if you've had some life experiences, whether that's in the financial sector, whether that's personal, professional, that have left some scarring, so to speak, you've built up these life experiences and the stories that you've created and associated. So that becomes your truth. And if you find that you're repeating similar patterns over and over again, whether it's personal, professional, financial, you'll find that if you start to peel back those layers of the onion and start going down deep into your subconscious, you'll start to recognise that and challenge some of those beliefs and say, well, actually, that's probably not right. So once you start working on yourself first, then you can start looking at the broader horizon.
So when it comes to someone's money then, how can somebody identify that scarcity mindset is prevalent in their lifestyle?
Yep. The first thing that I would recommend is what you do, you call it an emotional audit. So you basically, as I said, you start peeling back those onion layers. You go from surface all the way down into your deep subconscious and start challenging. When you have this belief, say, okay, what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, and what I'm believing, is that actually based on fact and reality? Or is that more a story that I've just built up over the time as being my reality? So basically, if someone is navigating towards the scarcity mindset, I liken it to, if you find yourself thinking like the Scrooge, you tend to sort of navigate towards negativity, pessimism. You're very cautious in the choices that you make, and you tend to sort of think you're more worried, or I guess, an over-indexing towards fear of loss. Yes, rather than fear of gain.
And it seems to be something that you would think is common with, say, first-time investors or first-time business owners. But I would imagine that there are certain types of people who can get a really long way through their lives without learning this.
Oh, absolutely. I think probably even the more experienced investor, if you have invested sometimes and you've been burnt, then that's that little scar I'm talking about. You're a little bit skeptical, a little bit hesitant to take the same risk again. So whether you again take that more as a, as a pathway to do a little bit of a deep dive inside, is my skepticism, is that based on fact and reality? Or is this more so a belief that I've built up over time?
And Andrew, that's really interesting when we talk about from an investment standpoint. Not every investment works. You and I have spoken about that before. And to pull back and to say, you know what, I'm never going to get involved in this stock or the stock market again, or I'm going to never buy a house because my last house didn't make the massive profit that I was expecting. What advice do you give people in that situation about their mindset?
This is a really interesting one where you're dealing with couples. And I'll come back to the couples. If it's a single, you've got to do that individual work to overcome that fear and understand why a particular investment didn't necessarily work. Was it you or was it the market? When I come back to talking to couples, which we do all the time, sometimes it's really good to have a person who, let's say, using your words, someone who'd been burnt by an investment, to have the other person be the final decision maker in terms of pulling the trigger. Not necessarily you make the decision together, but sometimes the one that's been burnt just can't bring themselves to pull the trigger. So you let the other person be the one that does pull the trigger on the investment to overcome that that complete fear, like Gabby was saying, of loss.
They often say that in relationships there's often the racehorse and the donkey, but you're not always the racehorse and you're not always the donkey, right? The idea is that you either help to lead the other person or you help to pull them back from a terrible decision there as well. I'm interested for you where you learned these tips and this advice, obviously to get to a point where you can speak on television about these and to coach people through it as well. Give me an understanding of where you've come from.
Oh, okay. A little bit about my background. I'll try to keep it as short and concise as possible. But my background, originally I started as a ballet dancer. So for me, I was, extremely goal-driven, very, highly focused from a very young age. I went off down to the Australian Ballet School and did my years there, then went overseas. And at the age of 19, my body said stop.
Wow.
So at 19, I had what's called, my first experience with an identity crisis.
Who am I?
Who am I? What do I do? Where do I go from here? And then from there, I started getting into corporate and spent the next 30 years basically working my way up in corporate, predominantly in sales and strategic sales and consultative sales. And through those roles, ended up in quite a few leadership roles where I was having to coach and mentor others. And up amongst the mix, on the personal side, I ended up in a marriage where it was, a lot of psychological abuse, having to live overseas for 20 years with no chance of returning home. So I was facing a lot of, what I call extreme adversity and challenges in my life, and facing this what I call almost like a time warp of 15 years or 19 years, where I had to think, how am I going to cope with this?
Yeah.
You can either sort of go down the pathway where you start to do the victim mindset and feel sad and sorry for yourself and everything is negative, pessimism,
yes,
and scarcity.
And which is a fascinating point, and I'm assuming it's at the ballet school, which is where you met Andrew. Just finally, just give us an idea about some tips for changing that mindset.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you're in the middle of the bushfire in your mind, it is hard to believe that you're ever going to be out of the eye of the storm, right?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It's there's several ways you can do it. Again, you've got to turn, instead of keep focusing on all the external factors, because that'll only continue to feed your anxiety and your fear. Look within and then start what we call cognitive reframing. So it's every time you find yourself defaulting to a negative view or a negative language that you're using internally, flip the switch and try to turn it into what we call a positive or optimistic viewpoint. So start paying attention to the languaging you're using on yourself. If it's predominantly on 90% negative, then I use another analogy is if you don't, you tune into a radio broadcast or a TV broadcast, if you don't like the messages that you're getting, you've got the power to actually tune into another channel.
Yeah. Gabrielle, really appreciate your time here on Ticker. Thank you so much for opening up to us and giving us that insight.
Thanks, Gabby.
Thank you for having me.
And a quick reminder that the program you've been watching is for information purposes only. Always do your own research before making any financial decisions. To learn more about how you can master your money, do visit theinvestorsway.com.au. That's how you get in touch with this wonderful man. Andrew, as always, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you so much. Ticker continues right after this.
You're watching Ticker. We'll have more in just a few minutes.